have you ever heard the form of execution called a Republican marriage? Or have you ever heard this story about a guy who executed his son simply for kissing a girl in public? Or how about a guy who was so scared as he was facing execution that his hair literally stood on end? For stories like this and many more about executions, stay tuned for this week's episode of Strange as It Seems. Welcome back. I'm Jeff Hix, curator of the Strange as It Seems archives and grand-nephew of John Hix, who created Strange as It Seems back in the late 1920s. For this week's episode, we're going to go into the macabre, this folder that I found in the archives on executions, hangings, electrocutions, and beheadings. Let's dive in. And so to kick off this episode, we'll start as we usually do in the era of John Hix, which started in the late 1920s. And the first one that came up here was the Prince of Hangmen. This is George Maledon, executioner of the 19th century, who was famous for hanging 69 men, 6 of them at once in one day. And apparently that was a record in the New World. And this is the story of the Prince of Hangmen in the Ghost Town News from the early 1940s. George Maledon, the Prince of Hangmen. And that story led me to this one of the most poignant stories I've ever found in the Strange as It Seems archives about John Ellis, who was a public executioner who had executed 203 men, and his final execution, a woman, pretty Miss Edith Jessie Thompson, but he was apparently a very sensitive man, kind of mild, undersized, but was Britain's essentially official executioner for 25 years. Amazing man. Who really had perfected the art of hanging people. And apparently this 203rd execution of the pretty Miss Edith Jessie Thompson really sent him over the edge. But he was shunned, and everywhere he went, people would frown at him and shun him. And finally, it just got to be too much. And the 204th execution that he made was of himself. Poor John Ellis hanged himself out of despair. Public executioner John Ellis, strange as it seems. And also amazing, on the back of this really is even more amazing stories of unexpected things that poison some people. More of the macabre. We have Miss Lucille Devine, who died from an ingredient to the paint in which she covered her body in her Javanese idol dance. And then we also have the dangerous habit that some women had, apparently, of dipping cigarettes into toilet water, perfume, and cause severe eye trouble and even blindness by chemical substances while smoking them after they had tried their cigarettes off in perfume. Crazy, strange as it seems. Did you hear about the 3 men that were brought to be executed by firing squad? And the first one, just about when they're about to shoot him, suddenly screams, "Avalanche!" And all the firing squad is completely discombobulated, and the guy runs away, gets away. Get ready to shoot the second guy. The second guy gets about to shoot him, and he says, "Earthquake!" And suddenly everybody ducks and runs for cover. Guy gets away. So they go up for the third guy, and he thinks, I'm going to do the same thing. So they line the guns at him, and he yells, "Fire!" This one from 1935, the man who was so afraid, apparently Probert, who was an English criminal, he was led to the scaffold in 1825, and his long gray hair actually stood on end. A man who was so terrified, his hair literally stood on end. And here's an extraordinary contraption from the Middle Ages, basically designed to hang medieval priests who apparently were untouchable by the executioner. So they were placed in these iron cages, hung outside the walls of the castle until they died of hunger. Strange as it seems. And the amazing story here of James Bobley from Wilkes County, Georgia, who was hanged for high treason against the state on the grounds that he stole a horse and some hogs back in 1781. But perhaps the most incredible thing about his story, it was the first time in the United States history that a defendant was tried a second time. Apparently, the trial jury first brought back a verdict of not guilty, and then the next day, as the record shows, the honorable attorney on behalf of the state motioned to the court that the trial of James Bobley should be reheard as he could produce more evidence. He produced more evidence, and James Bobley was hanged the next day. Strange as it seems. And a very sad story here, the story of Rush Griffin, a young black man who was granted a stay of execution after he was executed. Here's a photograph of the young man, Rush Griffin, and I have quite a bit of evidence. Apparently this was a pretty big story in Los Angeles at the end of the 1930s. And I've got letters here from the County of Los Angeles, the Office of the Public Defender, and the Office of the Sheriff. And the story here, this came from Mr. Bird, the Deputy Public Defender, and he gave notice of his appeal, which may be done simply by announcing in open court the defendant appeals from the judgment. And this unfortunate happening was that the deputy county clerk in the office of Mr. Ellis Hampton, the county clerk of Los Angeles, he failed to perform the duty of delivering the transcript to the office of the Supreme Court. And the poor young man was executed, and then shortly thereafter, the stay of execution came through. So the sad story of Mr. Rush Griffin from Los Angeles, California. Strange as it seems. And the two last ones from the John Hix era. Here is the 27-foot rope owned by George Maledon, the Arkansas Territory hangman that we talked about earlier. Apparently he had a 27-foot rope that he used to hang 27 men. We even have a little drawing of that rope as it appeared in Maledon's exhibit, kind of a macabre 27 feet of rope there. And the final one from the John Hix era was a story about the famous French statesman Mirabeau, who apparently was scheduled to be beheaded, died of natural causes, and instead a ragdoll was beheaded in his place when he was sentenced to death. The story of Mirabeau, famous French statesman, not beheaded, strange as it seems. A man's being taken to the gallows for an execution, and the executioner looks at him before he slips the noose over his head, and he says, "Do you have any last requests?" And the man says, "Yeah, can I have a high five?" Apparently the executioner left him hanging. Moving into the Ernest Hix era, after John Hix passed away on D-Day, June 6, 1944, had nothing to do with the war. He actually died of myocarditis. But Ernest Hix, my grandfather, and his brother carried the torch forward and carried the comic strip for another 3-4 years. Here is the Minaret of Death. Crazy. For 1,000 years, criminals were tossed. Here's a drawing of it. Were tossed from the 212-foot tower, the Minari Baliand, Minaret of Death. Strange as it seems. And another one from Ernest Hix here. In Japan, and this is interestingly enough, literally October 31st, so this would have been just a month or two, I think it was September of 1945 when Japan, it was VJ Day, right? I think it was September 2nd. But here, just shortly thereafter, about a month later, an interesting fact about what had happened in Japan, but an officer sentenced to death is shot through a curtain, and basically so that the privates who are executing him can't see that the man's of a higher rank. And the answer to a question from the top of the hour, also during the Ernest Hix era, the Republican marriage, which was a form of execution during the French Revolution, consisted of binding a man and a woman together and throwing them into the Loire River. Crazy. Practiced in 1793 at Nantes, France. Not mentioned in connection with any other locality, but execution technique known as the Republican marriage. Strange as it seems. Here's another one from the Ernest Hix era that is quite extraordinary. Pietro Lando, the Doge of Padua. He ordered his own son beheaded simply for kissing a girl on the street. Strange as it seems. Another one from the Ernest Hix era, the extraordinary story of Patrick Redmond. I believe this is Cork, the county of Cork, Ireland, back in the 1700s. He was hanged for robbery and swung for 9 minutes and then cut down. And apparently he was revived. Crazy. In a few minutes, he was back as good as new. And that night, he went to the theater to thank the actor Glover, who'd been one of his rescuers, and in the audience, thinking he was a ghost, apparently went into a panic. Patrick Redmond, hanged, but survived. strange as it seems. And the final story from the Ernest Hix era in executions, extraordinary. This is Zhang Shuiliang, strongman of Manchuria, invited his father's assassins to dinner. He dined them royally and then had them shot, and then gave each one of their widows $100,000 each. Amazing. And moving on to the Ellis Hix era in the 1950s, after Ernest Hix, my grandfather, died in a plane crash in 1948, and Ellis Hix picked up the torch and carried it forward. Here's another escape from hanging, saved by the rope. Apparently William Isaac Purvis. He was sentenced to be hanged in Mississippi, and he was saved because the knot broke. Former hostile bystanders insisted that his life not be put in jeopardy twice for the same crime. He was returned to prison, later proved innocent, and awarded $5,000 by the state. William Isaac Purvis, saved by the rope. What did the inmate say before he was executed by electric chair? I looked at it and said, I wouldn't be shocked if that didn't work. And here's an extraordinary story about the second Earl of Essex, Robert Devereux. Crazy. Basically was a favorite of Queen Elizabeth. He was born in about 1567. And documentary evidence shows that a man by the name of George Derrick, and we'll come back to this name later, a private, he was arrested in Calais, tried and convicted of the crime of rape. The Earl of Essex used his influence to save George Derrick. Amazing. And while he was in prison, George Derrick conceived of an idea of a new type of hanging apparatus. He set up a mast, fastened booms to the base of it, and with pulley arrangements could raise and lever. That's where the name Derrick came from, right? If you think of oil derricks and you see how pulleys left, they're named after this guy. But apparently when Devereux fell on the displeasure of Elizabeth, Robert Devereux, who saved Derrick, he was tried, Devereux was, and convicted of high crimes and misdemeanors. And guess who the official hangman was at the time? Robert Derrick. So while Devereux had saved Derrick at one time, Derrick became his executioner, and as far as we know, just stepped right up and executed Devereux. And he apparently looked right at Devereux and said, sorry, man, it's just my job. Wow. Incredible story of the Earl of Devereux and of George Derrick. Crazy, crazy. Strange as it seems. And here's one that reminds me of that horrific scene in Game of Thrones.
A crown for a king.
But the golden drink of death, this is a Valdivia, the conqueror of Chile, was killed by the Araucanian Indians, and apparently the gold he had stolen from them was melted down and poured down his throat. Gruesome death for Valdivia, the conqueror of Chile. And here's a story about the paramount chief of the Temne tribe. This is the natives of Sierra Leone in West Africa. And apparently the chief never dies a natural death. When he's about to expire, he's decapitated by his attendant. And after the head is dried, it's passed on to a successor, becomes an object of worship. And I love this. Here's a letter from the British Information Services. Dear Miss Hix, written to my grandma Elsie. Thank you for your letter of February 20th about the Temne tribe. The majority of this tribe lives in Sierra Leone. I enclose an extract, which is the view of Sierra Leone, which confirms your story as to action, but not as to reason. Crazy, crazy. Story of the Temne tribe of Sierra Leone, strange as it seems. And interestingly enough, there's only one crime in the U.S. that is deserving of execution. The only one that calls for a mandatory death penalty, and that is the court-martial for the crime of spying. And here we have a letter from the Department of Defense from 1956 from Hunt Clement, the chief press branch of the Department of Defense, and confirms this is the only article which provides a mandatory death penalty in the Uniform Code of Military Justice, spying. An amazing fact that my grandma published in the 1950s, but actually goes back, it looks like, to the 1930s. And we have here the warden of Sing Sing Prison. Crazy enough, Lewis Laws, Warden Laws of Sing Sing Prison. And apparently he proved this fact, but it said during his incumbency of 17 years as the warden of Sing Sing Prison, he received an average of 1 or 2 requests every single year from certain people that wanted to be put to death by the electric chair. Strange as it seems. And the final fact from the execution folder of the Strange as It Seems archives might have also gone with the coincidence episodes we did a ways back. Check out those. We did like 3 or 4 on strange and unusual coincidences. But here's one. Friday 13, Arthur West, who committed murder on Friday, was convicted on a Friday, was sentenced to die on a Friday. His appeal was denied on Friday, and he was hanged on Friday the 13th. Crazy. He walked up 13 steps to the gallows, and he was pronounced dead 13 minutes later, but died on Friday the 13th, 1935, the San Quentin Penitentiary. Arthur West. Strange as it seems. Well, that wraps it up for this week's episode. Taken from the Strange as It Seems archives and the folder on executions, hangings, electrocutions, and beheadings. If you like content like this, hit the bell to subscribe. Click like, click comment, leave me a note, send me a line. We'd love to hear from you. We'd love to hear any topics that you'd like us to cover here. And we'll see you next week for another episode of Strange as It Seems.